The rifle cracked against the grizzly's skull with a sound like thunder splitting timber, and Jacob Mercer knew in that instant he was either the bravest man in the Colorado Rockies or the biggest fool to ever draw breath. It was late summer in 1878, and the sun hung low over the aspens, painting them gold as Jacob made his way down from his trapline with 3 beaver pelts and a string of trout. He stood 6'4" in his worn boots, with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway and arms corded with muscle from years of wrestling logs, hauling game, and surviving in country that killed softer men. His dark hair hung past his collar, tied back with a strip of leather, and his beard was thick but trimmed close enough to keep the ice from forming in winter. At 28, he had spent the last decade alone in these mountains, preferring the company of pine trees and clear streams to the chaos of civilization. The scream that split the air was high and terrified, purely human, and it froze Jacob's blood in a way no mountain lion ever had. He dropped his pelts and ran toward the sound, his long legs eating up the rocky ground as he burst through a stand of lodgepole pines into a small clearing. What he saw there would burn itself into his memory forever. A young woman in a torn calico dress was backed against a boulder, her hands raised uselessly in front of her face, while a massive silver grizzly reared up on its hind legs not 10 feet away. The bear had to weigh 700 pounds, maybe more, its claws like curved daggers and its mouth open in a roar that shook the air. Jacob did not think. Thinking would have told him to run the other direction, to save himself, to let nature take its course. Instead, he charged forward with a bellow that came from somewhere deep in his chest, his rifle already swinging up. He fired once, the shot going wide in his haste, and then the bear was turning toward him with terrible speed. There was no time to reload. The grizzly dropped to all fours and rushed him like a freight train made of fur and fury. Jacob set his feet and swung the rifle like a club, putting every ounce of his considerable strength behind the blow. The wooden stock connected with the side of the bear's head with that thunderous crack, and the grizzly stumbled sideways, dazed, but far from finished. Jacob swung again, his muscles screaming with the effort, and this time the rifle butt caught the beast square on the snout. Blood sprayed from the bear's nostrils, and it shook its enormous head, backing up a step. "Run!" Jacob shouted to the woman, not daring to look at her. "Get out of here!" But the grizzly was not done. It came at him again, rising up on its hind legs, and Jacob knew with cold certainty that his rifle would not save him this time. The bear's paw came down in a sweeping arc, claws extended, and Jacob barely managed to throw himself sideways. He felt the wind of its passing, felt one claw catch his shoulder and tear through his buckskin shirt like paper. Pain blazed hot and immediate, but he rolled to his feet and swung the rifle again, this time catching the bear in the ribs. The grizzly roared in pain and rage, and for a moment Jacob thought it would charge again. He could see its eyes, dark and wild, could smell the rank odor of its breath. His rifle was cracked nearly in half now, useless as anything but kindling. He pulled his hunting knife from his belt with his left hand, the blade suddenly looking pitifully small. Then, from behind him, came a sound he did not expect. The woman had not run. Instead, she had picked up a fallen branch, a thick piece of deadfall as long as her arm, and she threw it with surprising force. It struck the grizzly on the back, and though it did no real damage, it was enough. The bear dropped to all fours, huffed once more, and then turned and lumbered away into the forest, leaving a trail of blood from its damaged snout. Jacob stood there, chest heaving, his shoulder burning with pain, watching until the bear disappeared into the shadows. Only then did he allow himself to lower the remains of his rifle. He turned slowly to look at the woman who had not run, who had stayed and tried to help him, even though she had nothing but a stick and her courage. She was younger than he had first thought, maybe 22 or 23, with dark auburn hair that had come loose from its pins and hung in wild tangles around her face. Her dress was torn at the shoulder and hem, dirty from travel and stained with pine sap. But it was her eyes that caught him, wide and green as new leaves, staring at him with a mixture of terror, relief, and something else he could not quite name. She was shaking like an aspen in a storm, her hands clutched together in front of her chest. "Are you hurt?" Jacob asked, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. She shook her head, but no words came out. Her gaze dropped to his shoulder, where blood was soaking through his torn shirt, and her eyes went even wider. bleeding," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "It is not so bad," Jacob said, though in truth he had no idea how deep the gash was. The adrenaline was still singing through his veins, making everything feel distant and unreal. "We need to get away from here. That bear might come back, or there might be others." The woman nodded, but when she took a step forward, her legs buckled. Jacob moved without thinking, catching her before she could fall. His hands closed around her arms, and he was struck immediately by how small she felt, how delicate. He had spent so long handling axes and traps and rough timber that he had forgotten what it was like to touch something that required gentleness. Her bones felt like bird bones under his calloused palms, fragile and fine. "Easy now," he said, his voice automatically softening. "You are safe. I have got you." She looked up at him, and for a moment their faces were close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, could feel her breath against his throat. Then she seemed to find her strength again, and straightened, though she did not pull away from his steadying hands. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was stronger now, though still shaking. "You saved my life. That bear would have killed me if you had not come." "What are you doing out here alone?" Jacob asked, finally releasing her arms and taking a step back. He needed distance, needed to think clearly, and that was impossible when she was close enough to touch. "These mountains are no place for a woman by herself." Something flashed in her eyes, something that might have been anger or pride or both. "I was not by myself. I was with a wagon train heading to California. We camped 3 miles south of here last night, and I went for a walk this morning to gather berries." She gestured to a basket lying on its side near the boulder, its contents scattered across the ground. "I got turned around, lost the trail back, and then I heard something in the bushes. I thought it might be a deer." "It almost was your funeral," Jacob said, more harshly than he meant to. The fear was only now catching up to him, making his hands shake and his voice sharp. "You should never wander off alone in country like this. There are grizzlies, mountain lions, wolves, not to mention the cliffs and ravines that could swallow you whole." "I know that now," she snapped back, her cheeks flushing with color. "I am not a fool, Mr. Whatever your name is. I simply made a mistake." "Jacob," he said, surprised by her spirit. Most people who came that close to death took longer to recover their fire. "Jacob Mercer." "Sarah," she replied, tilting her chin up slightly. "Sarah Catherine Blake." They stood there in the clearing, two strangers bound together by violence and chance, studying each other in the fading light. Jacob noticed details now that the danger had passed. The fine bones of her face, the way her hair caught the sun like copper wire, the stubborn set of her jaw that said she was stronger than she looked. There was dirt on her cheek and a scratch on her forearm, and her dress had seen better days, but she held herself with a kind of quiet dignity that spoke of good breeding and better character. "We need to get you back to your wagon train," Jacob said, forcing himself to be practical. "They will be worried about you." "Your shoulder," Sarah said, not moving. "It needs to be tended to first. You are still bleeding." Jacob glanced down and saw she was right. Blood had soaked through his shirt and was starting to drip down his arm. Now that she mentioned it, the pain was getting harder to ignore, a hot throb that pulsed with his heartbeat. "My cabin is not far," he heard himself say, though some part of him knew it was a bad idea to bring her there. His cabin was his sanctuary, the one place in the world that was entirely his, and he had not had another person inside it in 3 years. "I have supplies there, bandages and such. We can clean it up proper, then I will take you back to your people." Sarah hesitated, and he could see the conflict in her face. She had been raised to be cautious of strange men, to never go anywhere alone with them, but she was also practical enough to know that his shoulder needed attention, and that darkness was coming fast. "All right," she said finally, "but only to tend to your wound. Then you must take me back immediately. They will be searching for me, and I do not want them to worry any longer than necessary." Jacob nodded and bent to retrieve what was left of his rifle. The stock was cracked clean through, ruined beyond repair, but the barrel might be salvageable if he took it to a gunsmith. He slung it over his good shoulder and gestured toward the north. "This way. Stay close and step where I step. The ground is tricky in places." They walked in silence through the forest, Jacob leading and Sarah following a few paces behind. He was acutely aware of her presence, of the small sounds she made as she picked her way over roots and rocks, of the rustle of her skirt against the undergrowth. He slowed his naturally long stride to accommodate her shorter legs, and twice he reached back without thinking to offer his hand when the path grew steep or treacherous. The first time he did it, Sarah stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment before taking it. Her hand was small and soft in his, so different from his own scarred and calloused palm that it almost hurt to hold. He gripped her fingers carefully, gently, afraid that if he squeezed too hard, he might somehow damage her. It was the same feeling he got when handling robin eggs or the first spring wildflowers, that sense of something precious and breakable that required the utmost care. He helped her up over a fallen log and then released her hand immediately as if it had burned him. Sarah did not comment, but he thought he saw color rise in her cheeks again. The second time, when they had to cross a narrow stream by hopping from stone to stone, she took his hand without hesitation. Jacob held her steady as she made her way across, and this time he allowed himself to really feel the contact. Her skin was warm despite the coolness of the mountain air, and her grip was stronger than he had expected. When they reached the far bank, she held on for just a moment longer than necessary before letting go. "Thank you," she said quietly, not quite meeting his eyes. "Careful is all," Jacob replied, his voice gruff with an emotion he could not name. The cabin appeared through the trees just as the sun touched the horizon. It was a solid structure, built by Jacob's own hands from logs he had cut and stripped himself. The roof was tight, the chimney drew well, and there was a small lean-to on the side where he kept his horses and supplies. Smoke still rose from the chimney from the fire he had banked that morning, and the sight of it filled him with the same quiet satisfaction it always did. This was his, earned through sweat and skill and stubbornness. Sarah stopped at the edge of the clearing, taking it in with obvious surprise. "You built this yourself?" "Every log and nail," Jacob said, feeling an unexpected pride at the approval in her voice. "It is not fancy, but it keeps the weather out and the warmth in." "It is wonderful," Sarah said, and she sounded like she meant it. "I have never seen a cabin so well made. The ones we passed on the trail were all leaning or falling apart." Jacob felt something warm unfold in his chest at her words. He pushed open the door and gestured for her to enter, suddenly seeing his home through her eyes and hoping it would not disappoint. The interior was a single large room with a stone fireplace at one end, a bed built into the far corner, a table and 2 chairs in the middle, and shelves lining the walls that held his supplies and few possessions. Everything was neat and organized, a place for everything and everything in its place. Animal pelts covered the floor and hung on the walls, and his traps and tools hung from pegs near the door. Sarah stepped inside slowly, her eyes moving over everything with open curiosity. "You live here alone?" "Yes," Jacob said, moving to stir up the fire in the hearth. Flames licked up around the logs, casting dancing shadows across the room. "Have for 10 years now." 10 years, Sarah repeated, as if trying to imagine it. "That's a long time without company." "I prefer it," Jacob said, which was true, or at least had been true until about 30 minutes ago. Now, watching Sarah move through his cabin, touching his things gently with her fingertips, he found himself thinking that company might not be so bad after all. "Sit down," he said, pulling out one of the chairs at the table. "I will get the medical supplies." Sarah sat, folding her hands in her lap in a way that spoke of good manners and proper upbringing. Jacob rummaged in his supplies and pulled out a bottle of whiskey, clean cloths, and a jar of salve he had made from pine sap and healing herbs. He set them on the table, and then, feeling suddenly self-conscious, began to unbutton his shirt. He saw Sarah's eyes widen slightly, saw her look away quickly, a flush creeping up her neck. "Perhaps I should step outside while you change." "No need for modesty," Jacob said, shrugging out of his shirt and letting it fall to the floor. "You're about to clean this wound, so you will be seeing it anyway." Sarah turned back slowly, and Jacob watched her face as she took in his bare torso. He knew what she was seeing. Years of hard labor had carved his body into something more sculpture than flesh, all hard planes and defined muscle. Scars crisscrossed his skin, white lines and puckered marks that told the story of his survival. A wolf bite on his ribs from 4 winters ago, a knife wound on his left shoulder from a dispute with a claim jumper, burns on his forearms from a cabin fire when he was 19. But Sarah's eyes did not linger on the scars. Instead, she stared at the fresh wound the Grizzly had left, 4 parallel gashes running from his right shoulder down toward his collarbone. Blood still seeped from them, though the flow had slowed. "Oh," she breathed, going pale. "Jacob, this is worse than I thought. You need a doctor." "The nearest doctor is in Denver, 3 days' ride from here," Jacob said flatly. "This is not my first bear wound, and it will not be my last. Just clean it good and bandage it tight. It will heal." Sarah bit her lip, clearly uncertain, but she reached for the whiskey bottle with steady hands. "This is going to hurt." "Everything hurts in the mountains," Jacob said, and he almost smiled. "Pour it on." She uncorked the bottle and looked at him one more time, as if asking permission. Jacob nodded, bracing himself. Sarah tipped the bottle, and whiskey cascaded over his shoulder in a cold, burning stream. Jacob clenched his jaw against the pane, his hands gripping the edge of the table, hard enough to make the wood creak. But he did not make a sound. Sarah worked quickly and efficiently, using the clean cloths to wipe away blood and debris from the wounds. Her touch was gentle but sure, and Jacob found himself watching her face as she concentrated. Her brow was furrowed, her lips pressed together, and there was a fierce determination in her eyes that spoke of inner strength. She was not squeamish or hesitant. She did what needed to be done, even though he could tell it bothered her to cause him pain. "Where did you learn to do this?" Jacob asked, partly to distract himself from the burning in his shoulder, and partly because he genuinely wanted to know. "My father was a doctor in Boston," Sarah said, not looking up from her work. "He taught me some basic medicine before he died. He always said that everyone should know how to treat wounds and set bones, because you never knew when you might need to save a life." "He sounds like a wise man," Jacob said. "He was," Sarah agreed, and there was a sadness in her voice that made Jacob wish he had not asked. "He died 2 years ago from influenza. After that, my mother and I had to sell our home. We did not have much money left, and Boston was too expensive. My uncle in San Francisco wrote to us and offered us a place to stay, so we joined a wagon train heading west." "Your mother is with the wagon train?" Jacob asked. Sarah nodded, reaching for the jar of salve. She scooped out a generous amount and began to spread it over his wounds with careful fingers. The salve was cool and soothing, taking some of the sting away. "She will be frantic by now," Sarah said quietly. "I was supposed to be gone for an hour, 2 at most. It has been much longer than that." "We will leave as soon as you are done here," Jacob promised. "I will get you back to her safe." Sarah finished applying the salve and then began to wrap his shoulder with long strips of clean cloth, winding them around his arm and across his chest to hold the bandages in place. She had to lean in close to do it, close enough that Jacob could smell her hair, a scent like sunlight and wild sage. Her fingers brushed against his bare skin as she worked, and each touch sent sparks racing along his nerves. When she tied off the final bandage, she sat back and looked at him with concern. "How does it feel?" "Better," Jacob said, which was true. The pain had subsided to a dull ache, manageable and familiar. "You did good work, Sarah. Your father would be proud." A smile flickered across her face, brief but genuine. "Thank you. Now, I suppose you should put on a clean shirt before we go." Jacob stood and moved to the trunk at the foot of his bed, pulling out a fresh shirt and shrugging into it carefully. When he turned back, Sarah was standing by the door, her arms wrapped around herself against the growing chill of evening. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," she confirmed. They left the cabin and started south through the darkening forest. Jacob had strapped on his pistol and grabbed a torch, which he lit with a coal from the fire. The flickering light pushed back the shadows, making the path visible but turning everything beyond its reach into a wall of darkness. Night came quickly in the mountains, and with it came the cold and the sounds of predators beginning their hunts. Sarah stayed close to Jacob's side, so close that sometimes her shoulder brushed his arm. He did not mind. In fact, he found himself hoping she would stay that close. They did not talk much during the walk, saving their breath for the trek, but the silence between them was comfortable, companionable. About 2 miles from his cabin, they heard voices calling through the trees. "Sarah! Sarah Blake, where are you?" "Here!" Sarah shouted back, her voice ringing clear and strong. "I am here!" Dark figures emerged from between the pines, men carrying torches and rifles. There were 5 of them, all dressed in trail clothes, all looking worried and grim. When they saw Sarah, relief flooded their faces. "Miss Blake!" one of them exclaimed, a tall man with a gray beard and the bearing of someone used to command. "Thank God! Your mother has been beside herself. Where have you been?" "I got lost," Sarah explained quickly, "and then I encountered a grizzly bear. This man, Jacob Mercer, saved my life. He fought the bear with his bare hands when his rifle broke." The men turned to look at Jacob with new interest, taking in his size, his bandaged shoulder visible beneath his shirt, and the confident way he stood. The bearded man stepped forward and extended his hand. "Samuel Winters, wagon master. We are in your debt, Mr. Mercer. If you had not been there, well, I do not want to think about what might have happened." Jacob shook his hand, finding the man's grip firm and honest. "I did what anyone would have done." "Not anyone," Winters said seriously. "Most men would have run the other direction when they saw a grizzly. You are either very brave or very crazy." "Probably a bit of both," Jacob admitted, and several of the men chuckled. "Come back to camp with us," Winters urged. "Let us feed you at least and tend to that shoulder properly. It is the least we can do." Jacob hesitated. He was not a social man, and the thought of being surrounded by dozens of strangers made something in him want to retreat. But Sarah was looking at him with those green eyes, and there was hope in them, a silent plea for him not to disappear just yet. "All right," he heard himself say. "For a bit." They walked together through the forest, the men forming a protective circle around Sarah with Jacob at her side. She looked up at him once during the walk and smiled, and Jacob felt something shift in his chest, some long dormant part of him waking up and taking notice. The wagon train had formed a circle in a large meadow, about 30 wagons in all, with fires burning at intervals and people moving between them like shadows. As they approached, a woman broke away from one of the wagons and ran toward them with her skirts hiked up, moving faster than seemed possible. "Sarah!" she cried, and Jacob knew this had to be Sarah's mother. She had the same auburn hair, though streaked with gray, and the same fine bone structure. She crashed into Sarah and wrapped her arms around her daughter, sobbing with relief. "Oh, my darling girl. I thought I had lost you." "I'm all right, Mama," Sarah said, her own voice thick with tears. "I'm safe. Jacob saved me." Mrs. Blake pulled back and looked at her daughter, checking her for injuries with a mother's practiced eye. When she saw the torn dress and the scratches on Sarah's arms, her face went white. "What happened?" she demanded. "A grizzly bear," Sarah said simply. "It would have killed me, but Jacob fought it off." Mrs. Blake turned to look at Jacob, and he saw the exact moment when her maternal gratitude transformed into maternal concern. Here was a strange mountain man, big and rough and dangerous looking, alone with her daughter in the wilderness. He could read the worry in her eyes as clearly as if she had spoken it aloud. "Thank you for saving my daughter, Mrs. Blake said, her voice carefully polite. "We are very grateful." "No thanks needed, ma'am," Jacob said, taking an instinctive step back. He recognized dismissal when he heard it, and he understood. He was not the kind of man mothers wanted near their daughters. "I should be getting back now." "Nonsense," Samuel Winters interrupted, clapping a hand on Jacob's good shoulder. "You will stay and eat. We have venison stew and fresh bread. Besides, that shoulder needs to be looked at by someone with experience." "Sarah already tended to it," Jacob said, but Winters was already steering him toward one of the fires where a group of men and women were gathered. Jacob caught Sarah's eye over his shoulder, and she gave him an apologetic look that said she understood but could not help. The meal was good, better than Jacob's usual fare of game and beans. The people were friendly enough, asking him questions about the mountains and his life as a trapper. He answered in short sentences, uncomfortable with the attention, but not wanting to be rude. Across the fire, he could see Sarah sitting with her mother, eating from a bowl and talking quietly. Every few minutes she would glance in his direction, and each time their eyes met, Jacob felt that strange sensation in his chest again, like something tightening and releasing at the same time. After the meal, Winters pulled him aside. "Mr. Mercer, I have a proposition for you. We are heading through some rough country in the next few weeks, territory you likely know better than anyone. How would you feel about hiring on as a scout and guide? We could use someone with your skills, and we would pay fair wages." Jacob's first instinct was to refuse. He worked alone, always had. The thought of committing to these people, of being responsible for their safety, felt like a weight he did not want to carry. But then he thought of Sarah, of the way she had held that tree branch like a weapon despite her fear, of the softness of her hand in his and the strength in her eyes. How long would the job last? He heard himself ask. 3 weeks, maybe 4, depending on the weather and how fast we can move, Winters said. We need to get through the high passes before the first snow, which means we do not have much time to spare. 3 weeks. 4 at most. Jacob could manage that, could stand being around people for that long if it meant seeing Sarah every day. The realization surprised him, but he did not fight it. I will do it, Jacob said, but I need to go back to my cabin tonight to secure things and pack supplies. I will meet you here at dawn. Fair enough, Winters said, extending his hand again. They shook, sealing the deal. Jacob made his way toward the edge of camp, intending to slip away quietly, but Sarah intercepted him before he could leave. She appeared out of the darkness like a ghost, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. You are leaving? She asked, and there was disappointment in her voice. Just for tonight, Jacob said, surprised by how much he wanted to reassure her. I am coming back. Winters hired me on as a scout. Sarah's face brightened, and she smiled that smile again, the one that did strange things to Jacob's insides. Truly? Oh, I am so glad. I was afraid I would never see you again. You want to see me again? Jacob asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Sarah blushed, visible even in the dim firelight, but she did not look away. You saved my life today, Jacob Mercer, and you were kind to me, gentle, even though you are clearly a man capable of great violence. Yes, I want to see you again. They stood there in the darkness at the edge of the camp, close enough to touch but not touching, the space between them charged with something neither of them had words for yet. Jacob wanted to reach out, to take her hand the way he had on the trail, to feel that connection again. But there were people nearby, and Sarah's mother was probably watching, and he did not want to cause trouble for her. I will see you in the morning then, Jacob said, his voice low and rough. In the morning, Sarah echoed, and there was a promise in those words, an acknowledgement of something beginning. Jacob turned and walked away into the darkness, but he could feel Sarah's eyes on him until the trees swallowed him whole. The walk back to his cabin felt longer than usual, and for the first time in 10 years, the prospect of spending the night alone did not bring him peace. Instead, he found himself thinking of green eyes and soft hands, of courage and gentle touches, of a woman who threw sticks at grizzlies and bandaged wounds with steady fingers. He barely slept that night, lying in his bed and staring at the ceiling beams, his mind full of Sarah. When dawn finally came, he was already packed and ready, his supplies loaded on his pack horse and his cabin secured. He made the trip back to the wagon train in half the time it had taken the night before, driven by an eagerness he had not felt in years. The camp was already stirring when he arrived, people making breakfast and preparing to move out. Winters greeted him with approval and immediately put him to work scouting the trail ahead. Jacob threw himself into the job, checking the route for obstacles and dangers, marking the best places to ford streams and make camp. It was work he knew well, work that settled his nerves and gave his restless energy an outlet. But even as he worked, part of his attention was always on Sarah. He caught glimpses of her throughout the day, helping her mother with chores, walking alongside their wagon, laughing with some of the other young women in the train. Once he rode past close enough to hear her voice, clear and musical, telling a group of children a story. The children were rapt, their eyes wide, and Jacob found himself slowing his horse just to listen for a moment before forcing himself to move on. That evening, after the wagons had circled and the fires were lit, Sarah found him where he was tending to his horses. She approached quietly, carrying a plate of food, and when Jacob looked up and saw her, his heart did something complicated in his chest. I thought you might be hungry, she said, offering him the plate. You have been working all day without stopping. Jacob took the plate, his fingers brushing hers in the exchange. Thank you. You did not have to do this. I wanted to, Sarah said simply. She settled herself on a nearby log, arranging her skirts, and looked at him expectantly. Do you mind if I sit with you while you eat? Mind? Jacob almost laughed. He would have given his best horse for her company. I do not mind, he said, sitting down beside her and starting on the food. It was good, some kind of stew with potatoes and carrots, and he realized he actually was hungry. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, Jacob eating and Sarah watching the activity of the camp. Finally she spoke. "My mother is worried about you," she said, her voice quiet enough that no one else would hear. Jacob swallowed his mouthful of stew. "I know. She has good reason to be. I'm not the kind of man mothers want around their daughters." "Why do you say that?" Sarah asked, turning to look at him directly. Jacob set down his plate and met her eyes. "Because I am rough and uneducated. I live alone in the wilderness like an animal. I have killed men and fought bears and done things that would probably shock you. Your mother sees all that, and she wants to protect you from it." "She wants to protect me from everything," Sarah said, and there was frustration in her voice. "She has kept me wrapped in cotton since my father died, afraid I will get hurt or sick or lost. She means well, but sometimes I feel like I cannot breathe." "Is that why you went for that walk yesterday?" Jacob asked. "To get away?" Sarah nodded. "I just wanted a few minutes to myself, to see something beautiful without someone hovering over me and telling me to be careful. I did not mean for it to go so wrong." "But it did not go all wrong," Jacob pointed out. "You are alive, you are safe, and you learned something about yourself." "What did I learn?" Sarah asked, curious. "That you are braver than you thought," Jacob said. "You could have run yesterday when that bear turned on me, but you did not. You stayed and tried to help, even though you were terrified. That takes real courage." Sarah's cheeks flushed with pleasure at the compliment. "You think I am brave?" "I know you are," Jacob said firmly. "I have seen men twice your size run from less." They talked until the stars came out, sharing stories about their lives. Sarah told him about growing up in Boston, about her father's medical practice and her mother's social circles, about the books she had read and the places she dreamed of seeing. Jacob told her about the mountains, about tracking elk through new snow and finding hidden valleys that no white man had ever seen, about the harsh beauty of winter and the gentle abundance of summer. The more they talked, the more Jacob realized how much he enjoyed her company. Sarah was intelligent and curious, asking thoughtful questions and really listening to his answers. She did not flinch when he described the rougher aspects of his life, and she did not judge him for his lack of formal education. Instead, she seemed genuinely interested in his experiences, treating his knowledge of the wilderness with the same respect she might have given a professor's lecture. When Mrs. Blake finally came to collect her daughter, announcing firmly that it was time for bed, Sarah rose reluctantly. "Good night, Jacob," she said, and the way she said his name, soft and warm, made him want to hear it again and again. "Good night, Sarah," he replied, and watched her walk away with her mother, who shot him a warning look over her shoulder. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Jacob would scout ahead during the day, finding the best routes and checking for dangers. In the evenings, after his work was done, Sarah would find him, sometimes bringing food, sometimes just bringing herself. They would talk while the camp settled around them, sharing their thoughts and stories, learning each other in the way people do when they are circling around something bigger than friendship, but not quite ready to name it yet. Jacob found himself doing small things for her without thinking about it. He brought her wildflowers he found while scouting, mountain lilies and Indian paintbrush. He shot a rabbit and showed her how to prepare the pelt properly, teaching her with the same patience he might have shown a younger brother. Once, when the wagon train forded a particularly swift river, he waded out to Sarah's wagon and carried her across himself, holding her high against his chest so the water would not touch her skirts. She had wrapped her arms around his neck and laughed, breathless and delighted, and Jacob had wanted to keep walking, to carry her right out of the river and into the mountains and never come back. Mrs. Blake's disapproval grew more pronounced as the days passed, and Sarah's attachment to Jacob became obvious. She tried to keep them apart, inventing chores for Sarah to do in the evenings or encouraging other young men from the train to talk to her daughter. But Sarah was stubborn in her own quiet way. She finished her chores quickly and politely but firmly declined the attentions of the other men, and every evening she found her way back to Jacob's side. Winters noticed, of course. The wagon master was observant and sharp, and he pulled Jacob aside one evening about a week into the journey. "You are sweet on the Blake girl," Winters said. It was not a question. Jacob considered denying it, but what was the point? "Yes. And she is sweet on you, that's plain enough," Winters continued, "but her mother is not happy about it, and I cannot say I blame her. What are your intentions, Mercer?" "My intentions?" Jacob repeated, caught off guard by the directness of the question. Yes, your intentions. Are you planning to court her properly, or are you just passing the time until we reach California and you go back to your mountains? Jacob was quiet for a long moment, struggling with feelings he had never really examined before. What were his intentions? He had not thought that far ahead, had been living day to day, content just to be near Sarah. But Winters was right to push the question. Sarah deserved more than a pleasant distraction. She deserved honesty and commitment and a future. I do not know, Jacob admitted finally. I have never courted anyone. I have never wanted to until now. I do not know how to be anything but what I am, and what I am is not good enough for her. Why do you say that? Winters asked, echoing Sarah's question from days before. Because she is educated and refined, from a good family. She should marry a doctor or a lawyer, someone who can give her a nice house in a city with shops and schools and all the things women like. What can I offer her? A cabin in the wilderness? A life of isolation and hardship? That's not fair to her. Have you asked her what she wants? Winters said, and there was something knowing in his voice. Because from where I am standing, that girl looks at you like you hung the moon and stars. Maybe she does not want doctors and lawyers. Maybe she wants you. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Could Sarah really want the life he could offer? Could she be happy in his world, so far from everything she had known? Jacob did not have answers, but Winters had planted a seed, and it would not stop growing. That night, when Sarah came to find him as usual, Jacob was quiet and distracted. She noticed immediately, as she always did. What is wrong? She asked, settling beside him on their usual log. You seem troubled. Jacob struggled with how much to say, how much to reveal. In the end, he chose honesty, because Sarah deserved nothing less. Winters asked me what my intentions were toward you, he said, not quite meeting her eyes. Sarah went very still. And what did you tell him? That I did not know, Jacob admitted. Sarah, I care for you, more than I have ever cared for anyone. These past days with you have been the happiest I can remember. But I do not know what to do with these feelings. I do not know what you want from me or what I have a right to want from you. Sarah was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was soft but steady. What do you want, Jacob? Not what you think you should want, or what you think I should want. What do you want? Jacob finally looked at her, really looked at her, and the words came out before he could stop them. I want you to stay. When this wagon train reaches California, I want you to turn around and come back to the mountains with me. I want to wake up every morning and see your face. I want to teach you everything I know about the wilderness. And I want to learn everything you can teach me about the world. I want to hold your hand every day for the rest of my life. That is what I want. Sarah's eyes had gone bright with tears, but she was smiling. Then that is what we will do. Sarah, you do not understand what you are saying. My cabin is small and isolated. The winters are brutal. You would be giving up everything, civilization and comfort and your family. Your mother would never forgive me for taking you away. My mother will learn to accept it in time, Sarah said firmly, and I know exactly what I am saying. I am saying that I do not want the life my mother wants for me, a life of tea parties and social calls and marrying some boring man who sees me as a decoration for his home. I want adventure. I want to see the sunrise from a mountain peak and learn to ride horses properly and sleep under the stars. I want to be with a man who sees me as I really am and loves me anyway. I want you, Jacob Mercer, rough edges and all. Jacob felt something break open inside him, some wall he had built around his heart crumbling to dust. He reached out slowly, carefully, and took Sarah's hand in his. Her fingers curled around his immediately, fitting perfectly, and he held on like she was the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. I will do everything in my power to make you happy, Jacob said, his voice rough with emotion. I swear it. I know you will, Sarah said, and then she leaned forward and kissed him. It was a brief kiss, chaste and sweet, but it rocked Jacob to his core. Her lips were soft against his, warm and alive, and when she pulled back, he had to resist the urge to pull her close again. They were in the middle of camp, visible to anyone who might be watching, and the last thing he wanted was to damage Sarah's reputation. But Sarah did not seem concerned. She kept holding his hand, her thumb tracing small circles on his palm, and smiled at him with such joy that Jacob felt like he could conquer armies. "We should tell your mother," Jacob said reluctantly. "She deserves to know." "Tomorrow," Sarah said. "Tonight, let us just be happy." So they sat together under the stars, hands clasped, and talked about their future. Sarah had 100 questions about the cabin in the mountains, and Jacob answered each one, painting a picture of the life they would build together. He told her about the garden he could plant, how they could grow vegetables and herbs for cooking and medicine. He described the way the aspens turned gold in the fall, and how the first snow transformed everything into a wonderland. He promised to teach her to fish and track animals, to recognize edible plants and dangerous ones, to read the weather and the seasons. Sarah listened to it all with glowing eyes, occasionally interjecting with ideas of her own. She wanted to bring books, as many as they could carry. She wanted to learn to preserve food properly so they would have enough for winter. She wanted to eventually build a real bed frame and maybe even get chickens. The mundane details of daily life became magical when they talked about building them together. When Mrs. Blake finally came looking for her daughter, her expression was thunderous. She took in their joined hands and the way they sat close together, and her lips pressed into a thin line. "Sarah Catherine Blake, it is well past time you were in bed," she said sharply. "Come along now." "Good night, Jacob," Sarah said, squeezing his hand one more time before releasing it. She stood and walked to her mother with her head held high. As they walked away, Jacob heard Mrs. Blake's angry whisper carry back on the night air. "I will not have you throwing yourself at that mountain man, Sarah. You were raised better than that." And Sarah's reply, clear and firm, "I love him, Mama, and I'm going to marry him." Jacob sat alone in the darkness, those words echoing in his mind. She loved him. Sarah loved him. The knowledge filled him with a fierce joy and an equally fierce determination. He would prove himself worthy of that love, would work every day of his life to earn it and keep it. The next morning, Jacob approached Mrs. Blake formally, hat in hand, and asked permission to court her daughter. The conversation did not go well. Mrs. Blake was furious, accusing him of taking advantage of Sarah's naivety and gratitude. She said he was too old, too rough, too unsuitable. She threatened to have Winters fire him, to turn the entire wagon train against him. Jacob listened to it all calmly, letting her say her piece, and when she finally ran out of steam, he spoke. "Mrs. Blake, I understand your concerns and I respect them. You are right that I am not the kind of man you hoped your daughter would choose. But I love Sarah with everything I am, and I will spend my life making sure she never regrets choosing me. I will build her a good home, keep her safe, provide for her needs. I will honor her and cherish her and do everything in my power to make her happy. That is all I can promise, but I promise it with my whole heart." Mrs. Blake stared at him for a long moment, and some of the fury drained from her face, replaced by weariness and resignation. "She has already made up her mind, has she not? My stubborn girl." "Yes, ma'am," Jacob said honestly. "She has." "Then I suppose there is nothing I can do to stop this," Mrs. Blake said, and she sounded defeated. "But know this, Mr. Mercer, if you break her heart, if you harm her in any way, I will find you, and I will make you regret it. Mother's promise." "I would expect nothing less," Jacob said, meaning it. Over the following weeks, as the wagon train pushed deeper into the mountains, Jacob and Sarah's courtship became the talk of the camp. Most of the travelers approved, charmed by the unlikely romance between the rough mountain man and the gentle Boston lady. They would smile when they saw Jacob and Sarah walking together in the evenings, or notice the way Jacob's eyes followed her during the day. But there were a few who disapproved, mostly older women who thought Sarah was making a terrible mistake. They would whisper to Mrs. Blake about how Sarah was throwing her life away, how she would come to regret her hasty decision once the reality of frontier life set in. Mrs. Blake, to her credit, defended her daughter fiercely when she had accepted the inevitable, telling the gossips that Sarah was old enough to make her own choices and strong enough to live with them. The wagon train was about 3 weeks into the journey when disaster struck. They were crossing a high pass, the wagons strung out single file along a narrow trail with a cliff face on one side and a sheer drop on the other. Jacob was riding ahead, checking the trail, when he heard the scream. He wheeled his horse around and galloped back, his heart in his throat. One of the wagons had gotten too close to the edge, and the soft ground was crumbling beneath its wheels. The wagon was tilting, starting to slide, and inside he could see a woman and two small children frozen in terror. Jacob did not hesitate. He spurred his horse forward, throwing himself off the saddle while the animal was still moving. He hit the ground running and reached the wagon just as it started to go over. He grabbed the side rail with both hands and threw his weight backward, his boots digging into the dirt, his muscles screaming with the effort of holding back the wagon's momentum. For a moment, he thought he might actually be strong enough to stop it. Then he felt his feet start to slide, felt himself being pulled toward the edge along with the wagon. He was going to go over, he realized with cold clarity. He was going to die trying to save these people. Then, suddenly, there were hands on him, grabbing his arms, his belt, his shirt. Other men from the train had reached him, and they were pulling, adding their strength to his. Together, they dragged the wagon back from the edge, inch by agonizing inch, until it was on solid ground again. Jacob collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, his shoulders feeling like they had been pulled from their sockets. The woman and children were sobbing with relief, and the men were clapping him on the back, praising his quick thinking and courage. Sarah pushed through the crowd and dropped to her knees beside him, her face pale with fear. "Jacob, are you all right? Oh God, I thought you were going to fall. I thought I was going to lose you." Jacob pulled her into his arms, holding her tight despite his protesting muscles. "I'm all right. I'm fine, Sarah." She buried her face in his chest, and he felt her tears soaking through his shirt. He stroked her hair and held her until her shaking subsided, murmuring reassurances. That night, the wagon train celebrated Jacob's heroism with an impromptu party. There was music and dancing, and someone broke out a jug of whiskey that had been saved for special occasions. Jacob, uncomfortable with the attention, tried to slip away, but Winters caught him and made him stay. "You saved those people's lives today," Winters said. "The least you can do is let us thank you properly." So Jacob stayed, and he endured the thanks and the praise, and he drank the whiskey they pressed into his hands. And when Sarah pulled him into the circle of dancers, laughing and bright-eyed, he let himself be pulled. He did not know how to dance, had never learned, but Sarah taught him the basic steps right there, patient and encouraging. He stumbled and stepped on her toes more than once, but she just laughed and told him he was doing wonderfully. As they moved together to the music, Jacob realized something. This was what happiness felt like, not the solitary contentment of his mountain life, but something richer and fuller, a happiness that came from connection and love and being part of something bigger than himself. He looked down at Sarah in his arms, her face glowing with joy, and he knew with absolute certainty that he would never go back to being alone. Not now. Not ever. The final week of the journey passed in a blur of long days and longer nights. The train was making good time, and Winters predicted they would reach California right on schedule. Jacob should have been pleased, but instead he felt a growing anxiety. Once they reached their destination, he would need to say goodbye to these people who had become something like friends. More importantly, he would need to finalize his plans with Sarah to make sure she was truly serious about returning to the mountains with him. He need not have worried. Sarah was utterly certain about her choice. She began to make practical preparations, sorting through her belongings and deciding what to take and what to leave behind. She asked Jacob 1,000 questions about what they would need, and she made lists in a small notebook, her handwriting neat and precise. Mrs. Blake, seeing her daughter's determination, began to soften toward Jacob. She never became warm exactly, but she started inviting him to eat with them occasionally, and she would sometimes ask him questions about his life and his plans. Jacob answered honestly, hiding nothing, and he thought he saw grudging respect growing in her eyes. One evening, about 4 days from the California border, Mrs. Blake pulled Jacob aside for a private conversation. "Mr. Mercer, I want to speak plainly with you," she said. "I have been watching you these past weeks, seeing how you treat my daughter, and I will admit that I was wrong about you. You are a good man, perhaps better than I deserve as a son-in-law." Jacob started to protest, but she held up a hand. "Let me finish. I still do not like this plan. I still think Sarah could have an easier life if she chose differently. But I see that she is happy with you in a way she never was in Boston. She laughs more, talks more, lives more. You have awakened something in her that I thought my late husband's death had killed. For that, I am grateful." "I love her, Mrs. Blake," Jacob said simply. "I will do right by her, I swear it." "I know you will," Mrs. Blake said, and there were tears in her eyes. "But promise me something else. Promise me that you will bring her to visit me sometimes, once a year, maybe, or every other year. I cannot bear the thought of never seeing my daughter again." "I promise," Jacob said, meaning it. "We will visit. I will make sure of it." Mrs. Blake nodded, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "And promise me that if she ever wants to leave, if she ever decides that mountain life is not for her, you will let her go. Do not trap her with pride or obligation. Let her be free to choose." That promise was harder because the thought of losing Sarah was almost unbearable, but Jacob understood why Mrs. Blake asked it. "I promise. Sarah will always be free to choose her own path, even if that path leads away from me." The day the wagon train finally rolled into Sacramento, the entire camp erupted in celebration. They had made it, survived the long journey, and now the promised land of California stretched before them. Families embraced, plans were made, and futures that had seemed distant suddenly became immediate and real. Jacob stood at the edge of the celebration, watching it all with mixed feelings. He was happy for these people, glad they had reached their goal safely. But he was also eager to leave, to begin his own journey back to the mountains with Sarah at his side. That night, there was a huge feast, with everyone contributing what food they had left. There were speeches and toasts, and winners made a point of publicly thanking Jacob for his service as scout and guide, saying that the train would likely have lost people or wagons without his expertise. When the formalities were done and the dancing began, Jacob found Sarah standing alone, looking out at the lights of Sacramento in the distance. He came up beside her quietly, and she turned and smiled when she saw him. "It is beautiful, is it not?" she said, gesturing at the view. "A whole new world, full of possibilities." "Are you having second thoughts?" Jacob asked, needing to know. "This is your last chance, Sarah. Once we leave here, once we go back to the mountains, there is no easy way back. If you want to stay with your mother, to make a life here in California, I will understand." Sarah turned to face him fully, taking both his hands in hers. "Jacob Mercer, I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I do not want to stay in California. I do not want a city life or a conventional future. I want you, and I want the mountains, and I want the adventure of building something new together. Stop asking me if I am sure. I am sure." Jacob pulled her close, right there in front of everyone, and kissed her properly for the first time. It was not a chaste peck like before, but a real kiss, full of promise and passion and commitment. Sarah melted against him, her arms wrapping around his neck, and for a moment the rest of the world ceased to exist. When they finally pulled apart, Jacob was vaguely aware of cheers and whistles from the people around them, but he did not care. Let them see. Let the whole world see that this woman had chosen him, and he had chosen her, and nothing would ever change that. The next morning, Jacob and Sarah said their goodbyes. It was a tearful parting, especially between Sarah and her mother. Mrs. Blake held her daughter for a long time, whispering things Jacob could not hear, and when they finally separated, both women were crying. "Take care of her," Mrs. Blake said to Jacob, her voice shaking. "She is everything to me." "She is everything to me too," Jacob replied. "I will guard her with my life." They rode out of Sacramento as the sun climbed higher, just the two of them and Jacob's pack horse loaded with supplies. Sarah rode a sturdy mare that Jacob had bought for her, and though she was not an experienced rider, she learned quickly, adapting to the horse's rhythm with determination. The journey back to the mountains took longer than Jacob's trip out had taken, partly because they were in no hurry, and partly because he wanted to show Sarah things, to share with her the places he loved. They camped under the stars, and Jacob taught Sarah how to build a proper fire and cook over it. They forded rivers and climbed hills, and every day Sarah grew more confident, more comfortable in the wilderness. One night, about a week into their return journey, they camped in a high meadow filled with wildflowers. The sky was clear and filled with more stars than Sarah had ever seen, and she lay on her back in the grass, staring up in wonder. "I never knew there were so many," she breathed. "In Boston, you could only see a handful. But here, it is like someone spilled diamonds across the sky." Jacob lay down beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "This is one of my favorite places. I come here every summer to check my northern trap line. I always thought it would be more beautiful if I had someone to share it with. Now I do." Sarah turned her head to look at him, and in the starlight, her eyes were luminous. "Thank you for sharing it with me. Thank you for sharing your world with me." "It is our world now," Jacob said, reaching over to take her hand. "Ours together." They made love that night for the first time, there in the meadow under the stars. Jacob was gentle, almost reverent, treating Sarah like the precious thing she was. And Sarah met him with equal passion and trust, giving herself to him completely. Afterward, they lay tangled together in their bedroll, Sarah's head on Jacob's chest and his arms wrapped protectively around her. "I love you," Sarah murmured, already half asleep. "I love you too," Jacob replied, and he knew he would say those words to her every day for the rest of his life. They reached Jacob's cabin 3 days later, arriving in the early afternoon. Sarah's first view of what would be her new home was from the trail above, looking down at the clearing with the solid log structure and the mountains rising behind it. "It is perfect," she said, and Jacob felt relief wash through him. He had been worried, despite her assurances, that she would find it too small or too isolated. But the joy on her face was genuine. They spent the rest of that day and the next settling Sarah in, making space for her belongings and adjusting the cabin to accommodate 2 people instead of 1. Sarah threw herself into the work with enthusiasm, reorganizing Jacob's haphazard storage system and adding touches of comfort and beauty. She hung curtains made from fabric she had brought, arranged wildflowers in a jar on the table, and stacked her precious books on a shelf Jacob built for her. As the days turned into weeks, they fell into a comfortable routine. Jacob continued his work as a trapper, but now he returned each evening to find Sarah waiting for him, the cabin warm and filled with good smells. Sarah learned quickly, mastering the skills of frontier life with the same intelligence and determination she had shown on the trail. She learned to garden, to preserve food, to sew and mend clothes. She learned to recognize the tracks of different animals and to predict the weather by reading the sky. But more than the practical skills, Sarah brought joy and warmth to Jacob's life. She sang while she worked, filling the cabin with music. She read to him in the evenings from her books, opening up worlds he had never known. She challenged him in conversation, making him think about things he had never considered, and she loved him with a fierce devotion that humbled him every day. That first fall, as the aspens turned gold, just as Jacob had promised, they made the journey down to the nearest town, a rough settlement called Timber Ridge, 30 miles away. There, in a small church with a minister who looked surprised to see anyone, Jacob and Sarah were married. They had no witnesses except the minister's wife, no fancy clothes or elaborate ceremony. But when Jacob slipped a simple gold band onto Sarah's finger and she spoke her vows with tears in her eyes, it was more meaningful than any elaborate wedding could have been. They spent that winter snowed in, just the 2 of them in the cabin with the world buried in white outside. It should have been difficult, should have been a test of their relationship, but instead it was magical. They spent long evenings by the fire, talking and reading and making love. Jacob taught Sarah to play cards, and she taught him to dance properly. When the storms raged outside and the wind howled through the trees, they lay safe and warm in their bed, wrapped in each other and the life they were building. Spring came eventually, as it always did, melting the snow and bringing new life to the mountains. Sarah planted her garden, using seeds she had carefully saved and brought from California. She watched over it like a mother with a child, and when the first green shoots appeared, she called Jacob over with such excitement that he thought something was wrong. "Look," she said, pointing at the tiny sprouts. "We are growing things, Jacob. We are building a life." And they were. That summer, Sarah's belly began to round with their first child. Jacob watched the changes in her body with awe and not a little fear. The nearest doctor was still 3 days away, and the thought of something going wrong, of losing Sarah or the baby, terrified him. But Sarah was strong and healthy, and when her time came in late winter, she labored for 12 hours and then delivered a healthy baby boy with a set of lungs that could have called down avalanches. They named him Daniel, after Sarah's father, and Jacob held his son for the first time with tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," Jacob whispered, staring at the tiny face, the small fists, the shock of dark hair. "He is absolutely perfect." "He is ours," Sarah said, exhausted but glowing with happiness. "Our son." Jacob had thought he understood love before, thought his feelings for Sarah were the deepest he could go. But holding his son, watching Sarah nurse him with tender care, he discovered new depths. He would die for these two people, would fight armies and wrestle bears and cross any distance to keep them safe. They were his whole world. As Daniel grew from a baby into a toddler, the cabin became filled with new sounds. His laughter, his babbling attempts at words, his footsteps as he learned to walk. Sarah taught him his letters and numbers, reading to him from her books every night. Jacob taught him to recognize animal tracks and to move quietly through the forest. The boy was bright and curious, with his mother's green eyes and his father's strong build. When Daniel was 3, Sarah gave birth to a daughter they named Emily. She had Sarah's auburn hair and Jacob's size, a big, healthy baby who seemed determined to eat and grow as fast as possible. With 2 children, the cabin felt full but never crowded. There was always laughter, always activity, always life. True to his promise, Jacob took his family to visit Mrs. Blake in California once a year. The trips were long and difficult with small children, but they were important. Mrs. Blake doted on her grandchildren, spoiling them with sweets and toys and attention, and despite her initial reservations, she had to admit that her daughter was happy. Sarah bloomed in mountain life, growing stronger and more confident with each passing year. "You were right," Mrs. Blake told Jacob during one visit, watching Sarah play with the children in her uncle's garden. "She is happy with you, happier than I have ever seen her." "She made me happy first," Jacob replied. "Everything good in my life started the day I met her." The years passed the way years do, in a blur of seasons and milestones. Jacob and Sarah added a room onto the cabin to accommodate their growing family. They acquired chickens and a milk cow. Jacob's reputation as a trapper grew, and he began to make good money from his furs. They were not wealthy, but they had enough, and more importantly, they had each other. On a summer evening when Jacob was 42 and Sarah was 37, they sat together on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. Their children were grown now, Daniel, a young man of 14 who already stood as tall as his father, and Emily, a girl of 11 with her mother's grace and her father's strength. The children were inside, arguing good-naturedly about something, their voices carrying through the open door. "Do you ever regret it?" Jacob asked Sarah, the question that had haunted him for years finally spoken aloud. "Do you ever wish you had stayed in California, made an easier life?" Sarah turned to look at him, and there was nothing but love in her eyes. "Not for a single moment. This life, this place, you and our children, this is everything I ever wanted. I was just too young to know it when we met." Jacob reached over and took her hand, holding it gently, carefully, the way he had learned to hold precious things. Her hand was no longer soft and unused. Years of hard work had left it calloused and strong, but to him, it was still the most beautiful thing he had ever touched. "I love you," he said, words he had spoken 1,000 times, but which never felt like enough. "I love you too," Sarah replied, squeezing his hand. "My mountain man, my heart." They sat together as the sun sank below the peaks and the first stars began to appear. Hands clasped, hearts joined, 2 lives woven so completely together that neither could tell where one ended and the other began. Behind them, in the cabin they had built together, their children laughed and lived and grew. Around them, the mountains stood eternal and strong, bearing witness to the love that had transformed a lonely trapper and a lost girl into something greater than either could have been alone. And Jacob thought, as he had thought so many times over the years, that fighting that grizzly bear was the best decision he had ever made, because it had led him to Sarah, and Sarah had led him to this life, this beautiful, impossible, perfect life. The fire crackled in the hearth as they eventually moved inside, the family gathering around the table for dinner. Daniel was telling a story about tracking an elk he had seen that morning, using grand gestures that made Emily roll her eyes and laugh. Sarah moved around the table, serving the meal she had prepared, her movements easy and practiced. Jacob watched them all, his family, his world, and felt gratitude so profound it almost hurt. Later, after the children had gone to bed and the cabin was quiet, Jacob and Sarah lay together in their bed, the one he had built with his own hands, but which had become truly theirs over the years. Sarah's head rested on his chest, her hand over his heart, feeling it beat steady and strong. "Do you remember the first time you held my hand?" Sarah asked quietly. "On the trail, when you were taking me back to the wagon train." "I remember," Jacob said, his voice a low rumble in the darkness. "I was afraid I would hurt you. Your hand was so small in mine, so delicate. I held it like it might break in two." "You still do," Sarah said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "Even after all these years, even though my hands are as rough as yours now, you still hold me like I am made of glass." "Because you are precious," Jacob said simply, "the most precious thing in my world. I will always handle you with care." Sarah shifted, propping herself up on one elbow to look down at him in the dim light. "And you are precious to me, my brave, strong, gentle man. Do you know what I thought the first time I saw you?" "That I was a wild man, probably," Jacob said with a chuckle. "I thought you were the most magnificent thing I had ever seen," Sarah corrected. "This huge man, all muscle and courage, fighting a bear with nothing but a broken rifle and his own strength. I thought you were something out of a legend, a hero from one of my books come to life." "I am no hero," Jacob protested. "I just did what needed doing." "You saved my life," Sarah said firmly. "And then you saved it again by showing me what kind of life I could have, what kind of love was possible. You gave me everything, Jacob, everything that matters." Jacob pulled her down for a kiss, long and deep and full of the love that had only grown stronger with time. When they finally parted, both were breathing hard, and the air between them was charged with the passion that had never dimmed despite the years and the children and the daily routines of life. They made love that night with the practiced ease of long familiarity, but also with the desperate intensity of people who knew how precious and fragile happiness could be. Afterward, they lay tangled together, Sarah's hair spread across Jacob's chest, his arms wrapped protectively around her. "Promise me something," Sarah whispered into the darkness. "Anything," Jacob replied immediately. "Promise me that when we are old and gray, when our children have children of their own, we will still do this. We will still sit on the porch and hold hands and watch the sunset together." "I promise," Jacob said, meaning it with everything he had, "every sunset for the rest of our lives." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other and in the certainty of their love, while outside the mountains stood watch over them and the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. Years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges. Daniel grew into a strong young man who eventually married a girl from Timber Ridge and built his own cabin 5 miles from his parents' place. Emily met a young doctor who had come west seeking adventure, and after a proper courtship, they married and settled in a growing town called Boulder Creek, a 2-day ride from the mountains but close enough for regular visits. Jacob and Sarah became grandparents, welcoming 3 grandchildren in quick succession. They spoiled the little ones shamelessly, teaching them the same lessons they had taught their own children. Jacob showed the boys how to track and hunt, while Sarah taught them all to read and to love learning. The cabin that had once seemed so isolated became a gathering place, a center of family activity where children and grandchildren came for visits that often lasted weeks. Mrs. Blake passed away peacefully in her sleep when Sarah was 45, and though Sarah mourned her mother, she took comfort in knowing that they had reconciled, that Mrs. Blake had seen and accepted her daughter's happiness before the end. As Jacob entered his 50s, he began to slow down slightly, not ready to stop working, but willing to admit that he could not cover as much ground as he once had. Daniel took over more of the trap lines, working in partnership with his father. Jacob found he did not mind. There was joy in teaching his son, in watching him become a man as capable and strong as Jacob himself had been. Sarah aged gracefully, silver threading through her auburn hair and lines appearing at the corners of her eyes. But to Jacob, she was as beautiful at 50 as she had been at 23, perhaps more so because now her beauty was layered with experience and wisdom and the patina of a life well lived. They still sat on the porch every evening when weather allowed, still held hands and watched the sunset. They still made love regularly, though perhaps less frantically than in their youth, with a tenderness that spoke of deep knowledge and enduring passion. They still talked for hours, never running out of things to say, always interested in each other's thoughts and dreams. When Jacob was 60 and Sarah was 55, they made the decision to pass the cabin and the trap lines to Daniel and his family. They were not retiring exactly, but they were ready for something different. Together, they built a smaller cabin closer to Boulder Creek, near Emily and her doctor husband. It was still in the mountains, still wild enough to satisfy Jacob's need for space and beauty, but close enough to town that Sarah could visit her daughter often and have access to books and supplies. The new cabin was smaller than their original home, but beautifully crafted, built with all the skills Jacob had accumulated over a lifetime. Sarah designed the interior, creating a space that was both comfortable and efficient. They had a large window that faced the mountains, and they positioned their bed so they could see the peaks when they woke each morning. Life in the new cabin was peaceful, a gentle twilight after the adventure and hard work of their younger years. They tended a large garden together, read extensively, and welcomed a steady stream of family visitors. Their grandchildren adored them, running to their cabin whenever possible to hear Jacob's stories of the old days and to sample Sarah's cooking. On a crisp fall morning, when Jacob was 68 and Sarah was 63, they woke to find the world transformed by the first real snow of the season. Everything was blanketed in white, the trees frosted like something from a fairy tale, and the mountains gleamed in the distance. "Beautiful," Sarah breathed, standing at the window and looking out. Jacob came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on top of her head. "Not as beautiful as you." Sarah laughed and swatted at him playfully. "You old fool, I'm 63 years old with gray hair and wrinkles. And I'm 68 years old with creaky knees and a back that aches when it rains," Jacob countered. "But you are still the most beautiful woman I have ever seen, and I am still the luckiest man alive." They stood there together, watching the snow fall, comfortable in the silence and in each other's presence. After all these years, they had learned that love was not just passion and romance, though they still had plenty of both. Love was also this, the quiet moments, the comfortable silences, the simple joy of being together. "Do you remember what you promised me?" Sarah asked after a while. "About holding my hand and watching sunsets, even when we were old and gray?" "I remember every promise I ever made to you," Jacob said seriously, "and I have kept every one." "You have," Sarah agreed, turning in his arms to face him. "You have been everything I could have asked for, and more. You have been my adventure, my safety, my home. You have been my love." Jacob cupped her face in his large, weathered hands, holding her gently, carefully, the way he always had. "And you have been mine. Every good thing in my life, every moment of happiness, every reason I had to keep going when things got hard, all of it came back to you. You were worth fighting that bear for. You were worth everything." They kissed then, a long, sweet kiss that held 40 years of love and commitment and partnership. When they finally pulled apart, both had tears in their eyes, the happy tears of people who knew how rare and precious their love was. That evening, despite the cold and the snow, they bundled up in heavy coats and furs and sat on their porch, hands clasped together between them. They watched the sun set over the snow-covered mountains, painting the white world in shades of pink and gold and purple. "Another sunset together," Sarah said softly. "How many do you suppose we have watched?" "Not nearly enough," Jacob replied. "I want 1,000 more, 10,000. "We might not have that many left," Sarah said practically, but there was no sadness in her voice, only acceptance. "Then we will make the most of every one we do have," Jacob said firmly. He squeezed her hand gently, carefully, and she squeezed back with equal tenderness. They sat there as the light faded and the stars appeared, two people who had built a life together from nothing but courage and love. Behind them, their cabin stood warm and welcoming. Around them, the mountains kept their eternal vigil. And in their joined hands was the sum total of everything that mattered: connection, commitment, and a love that had proven stronger than fear, stronger than doubt, stronger than anything the world could throw at it. The mountain man had fought a grizzly with his rifle butt all those years ago, using all his strength and courage to survive. But he had learned to hold her hand like it might break in two, understanding that real strength was not just about power, but about gentleness, that the truest courage was the willingness to be tender and vulnerable and open to love. And Sarah, the lost girl from Boston who had wandered into the mountains looking for berries, had found something far more valuable. She had found adventure and purpose, and a love that transformed her from someone who merely survived into someone who truly lived. She had found her home, not in a place but in a person, in the mountain man who had saved her life, and then had given her a reason to live it fully. Years later, when Jacob was 75 and Sarah was 70, they still sat on that porch every evening, weather permitting, holding hands and watching the sunset. Their family had grown to include great-grandchildren now, a whole tribe of young ones who carried pieces of both Jacob and Sarah forward into the future. Their love story had become family legend, told and retold at gatherings, an inspiration and a promise that true love was not just a fantasy but something real and achievable and worth fighting for. Jacob's body had finally begun to fail him in small ways, the accumulation of decades of hard living catching up at last. But his mind was still sharp, and his love for Sarah burned as bright as ever. Sarah had grown fragile in recent years, her bones becoming brittle and her strength waning, but her spirit remained undiminished. On a perfect summer evening, with the aspens rustling in a light breeze and the sky painted in brilliant colors, Jacob and Sarah sat on their porch for what would be one of their final sunsets together. They did not know it was one of the last, of course. You never do. But perhaps some part of them sensed it, because they held hands a little tighter and looked at each other a little longer. "Thank you," Sarah said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "For what?" Jacob asked, though he thought he knew. "For everything. For fighting that bear. For bringing me to this life. For loving me so well and so long. For being exactly who you are." Sarah's voice was thick with emotion. "For holding my hand like it might break in two for 50 years. Jacob brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "You are the one who deserves thanks. You took a chance on a rough mountain man who had nothing to offer but his heart. You left everything you knew to build a life in the wilderness. You made me better than I ever thought I could be. You gave me a reason to be gentle." "We made each other better," Sarah corrected. "That is what love does. It makes you more than you could ever be alone." They sat in silence after that, watching as the sun touched the horizon and began its descent. The mountains glowed in the fading light, eternal and beautiful and indifferent to the small human dramas playing out in their shadow. But Jacob and Sarah had carved their own place in those mountains, had left their mark through their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, through the cabins they had built and the lives they had touched. When the last sliver of sun disappeared and the first stars began to appear, Jacob stood carefully, his knees protesting, and helped Sarah to her feet. He kept hold of her hand as they made their way inside, moving slowly, supporting each other as they had always done. That night they lay in their bed, Sarah tucked against Jacob's side with her head on his shoulder, his arm around her, keeping her close. They talked about their children and grandchildren, about memories and moments they treasured. They laughed about mistakes they had made and adventures they had survived. And when sleep finally claimed them, it found them still holding hands, still together, still in love. Jacob lived to be 82, and Sarah made it to 77, dying peacefully in her sleep with Jacob holding her hand one final time. Jacob followed her 6 months later, his body finally giving out, but his heart at peace. He had kept his promises. He had held her hand through everything life threw at them. He had loved her every single day. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking their first cabin, the one Jacob had built with his own hands and where they had begun their life together. Their graves were marked with simple stones bearing their names, the years of their lives, and a single inscription that Daniel had chosen. They were everything to each other. The cabin still stood, maintained by their descendants, a testament to what could be built with skill and determination and love. The family still gathered there sometimes, telling stories of Jacob and Sarah, of the mountain man who had fought a grizzly with his rifle butt, and the Boston lady who had thrown a stick at the same bear. They told stories of a love that had conquered fear and distance and hardship, that had proven stronger than death itself, because it lived on in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried it forward. And sometimes, on summer evenings when the sunset painted the mountains gold and the aspens whispered in the breeze, Those gathered at the cabin would swear they could feel Jacob and Sarah there still, sitting on the porch, holding hands, watching one more sunset together. Because some loves are too strong to be contained by a single lifetime, too powerful to be ended by something as small as death. They echo forward through generations, a reminder and a promise that true love exists, that it endures, and that it is always, always worth fighting for. The story of the mountain man and his lady became more than just family legend. It spread through the region, told in taverns and around campfires, a true tale of courage and love that inspired others to take chances, to follow their hearts, to believe that love could conquer anything if you were brave enough to fight for it and gentle enough to cherish it. And at the heart of every telling was the same beautiful contradiction. The man who fought bears with his bare hands but held his wife's hand like it might break in two. Because that was the truth of Jacob Mercer, the truth that made him extraordinary. He was strong enough to face any danger, brave enough to risk everything, but wise enough to know that true strength lay not in how hard you could fight, but in how gently you could love. Sarah had seen that in him from the beginning, had recognized in the rough mountain man someone capable of great tenderness. And she had given him the gift of her trust, her love, and her life, allowing him to be both the warrior and the gentle lover, both the protector and the protected. Their story ended as all stories must, but the love they built together lived on, a beacon for anyone who wondered if real love still existed in a harsh world. It did. It does. It always will, for those brave enough to fight for it and gentle enough to hold it carefully, like something precious that might break in two. The mountains stood eternal witness to this truth, and the sunset continued to paint the sky in brilliant colors every evening, a reminder that beauty and love and meaning could be found anywhere, even in the wilderness, if you opened your heart enough to let them in. Jacob and Sarah had done exactly that, and in doing so, they had created something that would never die, a love story for the ages, as enduring and beautiful as the mountains themselves.